Hello everyone, I'm Jessie, and it's time for a scary story. But first, let me say that today is also the first day of Drawlloween. This year, I'll be following Mab Graves Drawlloween club list, and I've decided each day I'm going to post a speed process video here on my channel for each prompt. Today's prompt is Vampire. Now that the introduction is out of the way, how's about we get on to that story? It's time for you to find a comfy place to sit, maybe grab a blanket, turn out the lights, and have a listen. Filii Noctis, written and narrated by JessiLeigh. Grace wasn't a social person. In high school, she kept mainly to herself. Not that anyone cared to invade her space anyway. This isn't to say she was disliked. No, she simply just wasn't noticed, and she liked it this way. It's what made her glad that she had inherited her father's plain features and dark hair, rather than her mother's bright blue eyes and flaming auburn hair. The way she saw it, it was easy to miss the quiet girl with glasses if she kept her distance and hid behind her books long enough. More often than not, you'd find her taking her lunch hidden behind the walls of bookshelves in the school library, a place where she could read in peace without all the chatter of her classmates in the cafeteria. No one to pull her out of whatever story she was currently reading and force her into being social. If she had it her way, she'd be content with just being alone all the time. Just her and her books. It was all she needed. Her mother, on the other hand, did not share Grace's ideals. She had always been a social butterfly. When she was young, she was in all sorts of clubs and sports, and even joined a sorority in college. She loved being around people, and she couldn't for the life of her understand why her Grace couldn't be the same, often pushing her daughter to try and be more outgoing, with very little success. Grace just preferred the company of her books to people. Not unexpectedly, this didn't change when she left home for college. Grace would have loved nothing more than to spend the little free time she had that wasn't taken by classes or studying, just staying in her dorm with her nose in a book. Grace's mother, however, had different plans. She was hell-bent and determined to make her daughter engage with other people while she was away, even if she had to threaten to stop paying for her daughter's classes to make it happen. And that is why Grace is now sitting in the foyer of a chapter house for one of the more mysterious social clubs on campus, Filii Noctis. It wasn't her first choice by any means. That would have been not joining a club at all. Heck, she didn't even know what this club did or really what they stood for that matter. However, she had accidentally missed all the deadlines for pledging to the sororities, and by the time her mother had finally cracked down with the threat to leave her on her own to pay her tuition, this was the only club still accepting applications, as the only social club on campus to feature year-round admission. Begrudgingly, Grace had filled out the online form in the cafeteria and submitted it, not having any time to research the club beforehand. The most she knew was that the consensus around campus was mixed. Some looked upon it with a strange bewilderment, wondering what secrets were held within the doors of the chapter house. This was probably one of the bigger factors in its reputation. Filii Noctis had its own chapter house, despite not being a fraternity or sorority. Most clubs on campus didn't. In fact, none of them did, especially not one as old and as fancy as Filii Noctis had. But the club had apparently funded itself and had been around since the founding of the college, so it was more or less grandfathered in. It really wasn't hurting anything, and apparently retained enough of membership to sustain its existence, despite the rumors that admission was very selective, so there was really no reason for the college to shut it down. While there were those who were in awe of the club, even more had less admiration for it, throwing mildly suspicious glances toward the house and its leaders, wondering how a club such as itself could exist for so long on campus despite no one but its members really knowing what they did. There were a few rumors thrown around of cult activity and sacrifices, but Grace just chalked these up to stories created out of the fear of the unknown and the fact that the club's chosen title, Filii Noctis, was Latin for Children of the Night. Something like that was bound to be subject to rumors of the occult variety. Grace didn't let these rumors get to her, though. She was sure it was perfectly safe. It was probably just a group of pretentious people who enjoyed their solitude and wanted something flowery for their resume despite not doing anything. If that was the case, then perhaps she could actually somewhat get on board without too much complaining. She wouldn't be fond of the pretentiousness, mind you, but if she was allowed to join and wasn't required to interact much, she could get over it. After all, she didn't have much of a choice. She could either join the club, or be out of luck when it came time to pay for classes next semester. To Grace's surprise, Filii Noctis almost immediately accepted her application for an interview. She had expected to wait at least a few days, if she were to be accepted at all. Perhaps the rumors really were unfounded, because by the time she had gotten back to her dorm from the cafeteria, she found that she had an email from the club with the date and time to come to the chapter house and be interviewed along with the other applicants. The next evening, at 8 p.m. It did seem a little late for an interview, but Grace supposed this was one of the many reasons why the club had such a weird reputation around campus. Grace looked around the foyer in which she now sat. The interior design seemed similar to that of the exterior of the house, which is to say, elegant and very old. The bottom of the room was walled with wood paneling that matched the dark oak hardwood floors. The upper half was finished out with a deep red patterned wallpaper. To her right stood a set of large wooden double doors near an elegant wooden staircase. Another door, a single, stood near that, directly across from the front door, near which Grace was sat. To her left were another set of double doors, only these happened to be open, and appeared to lead into a library of sorts. Seeing this pleased Grace. Perhaps this wouldn't be so bad if she was allowed access to what she assumed was the club's private library. She momentarily wondered if she would be expected to move into the chapter house if her interview went well, just as one is sometimes required to do if they joined a sorority. If so, she knew she'd probably spend most of her time in that library. Glancing again at the walls, she noticed portraits hung in opulent wooden frames around the foyer, no doubt depicting images of important members or leaders of years past. Further examination from where she sat revealed to Grace that the images were paintings, rather than photographs, as she had originally assumed. A quick glance at the dates revealed that the most recent portrait was dated from 3 years ago. This surprised Grace. Not many went to the expense to commission actual painted portraits anymore. Most opted instead to have the portraits taken by a photographer. One thing was certain, this club obviously had money to spend, judging from its apparent expensive taste. Grace feared this was foreshadowing that the club members would likely be pretentious as hell, and she internally groaned, hoping that if she were accepted, that at least the library would be worth the snobbery. After Grace had finished surveying her surroundings, she allowed her eyes to fall upon the only other applicant in the room. A young woman with black hair and lipstick to match her also black outfit sat on the other side of the foyer on an intricately carved wooden bench near the staircase. She resembled the stereotypical goth girl, and she smiled warmly as Grace's eyes met her own. She seemed friendly enough, but Grace couldn't help notice that no other applicants were joining them, and it was already a few minutes past the time the email said the interviews would begin. The email implied there would be more applicants waiting for their interviews. She convinced herself this was because admissions for this club were open year-round, and because of this they probably just used a similar email script for everyone. She and the other young woman were just late applicants, stragglers applying later than everyone else had. As if on cue after that thought, the single door directly across from Grace opened, and a tall, gaunt man came to greet the two young women. He introduced himself as Mr. Grayson and beckoned them to follow him, as the others were ready to proceed with the interview. This struck Grace as odd. Were they going to be doing their interviews together? Weren't interviews usually done separately? Privately? Also, he said that the others were ready. Who did that mean? Were they going to be interviewed by the club leaders? His phrasing almost implied that the entire club would be interviewing them, which seemed very odd. Grace didn't voice these concerns. She didn't want to appear rude. Yes, she might have applied to join the social club under duress, but she knew she needed to be accepted into this club if she wanted her mother to continue paying for her classes. She was going to do her best not to blow it. Mr. Grayson led the young women through a short hall until they reached another set of wooden double doors. Mr. Grayson opened the doors and motioned for Grace and the other young women to enter before him, and he followed behind. This room was large and appeared as elegant as the foyer had been, if not more so. The wall on the far side of the room was made up nearly of glass. 2 large windows flanked either side of a set of French doors that opened up to a grand porch. Despite the dim twilight, Grace could see the craftsmanship of the wood columns and the brickwork that laid outside the curtain-framed windows. The rest of the room was made up of the same wood paneling and wallpaper as had been in the foyer, only this time the color of the wallpaper was a shade of dark gray. A large lit fireplace was a main feature on the right side of the room, made from brick and stone and trimmed with woodwork, reaching from the floor to the ceiling. More painted portraits also adorned this room's walls as they had in the foyer, the largest being a painting of a blonde, shaven man, wearing a tailcoat and a cravat, standing with a dark-haired woman in a simple green Regency-era gown hanging over the aforementioned fireplace. Grace assumed they must have been the club's founders, as she could see the chapter house was painted in the background of the portrait. After Grace had taken in the age and elegance of this new room, it finally hit her just how many people were waiting inside. There must have been at least 20 people, some sitting in the couch and armchairs, and more sitting in wooden chairs that had clearly been brought in for the occasion. They really were about to be interviewed by the entire membership of this club. Though taken aback by the bizarreness of the situation, Grace still took a moment to be grateful that at least the seating was arranged in a broken semicircle, so that they hadn't walked in on 20 faces staring directly at them. But the shock of being brought in to face so many at once was weighing on her. She looked over at the other applicant and was surprised to see that she didn't look shocked at all. Before she could concern herself with it any further, a thin woman and a light-haired man stood up from the couch and nodded to greet the pair, motioning for them to approach the opening in the circle as Mr. Grayson took his seat among the other members. "Hello, welcome to Filii Noctis," the woman said, once Grace and the other young woman took their place to stand in the opening. "I'm Rosemary Norwood, the club chapter president, and this is Vice President Devon Moreno." Rosemary was a pale woman with dark brown hair and darker brown eyes. The man she gestured to had more of a stocky build, with a head of short, wavy blonde hair and a beard to match. They were both dressed smartly, but didn't outright seem to be overly pretentious as Grace had feared. As the young women nodded a greeting in return, Grace noted that Rosemary looked a bit like the woman in the portrait. No doubt she was likely the great-granddaughter of the woman. Probably came from one of those families that expected each generation to follow the previous generation's footsteps out of some strange sense of tradition. Rosemary continued talking. "I know some of us already know Willow." She gestured to the other applicant. "But would you young ladies mind introducing yourselves to the other members? Please state your current year and how you heard about this club." Rosemary's charming smile did nothing to quell the awkwardness Grace felt. She slightly envied the other young woman, who revealed that she was a younger sister to one of the current members in her introduction. The fact that she already seemed to have prior knowledge of the club seemed to alleviate any awkwardness for her, as she didn't seem the least bit fazed by any of this. Grace, on the other hand, had many questions. Was this the interview? Were they expected to stand on the edge of the circle and be interviewed in front of the whole chapter? Yes, it was true that Grace had never attended a club before, but was this really how it worked? This honestly seemed more like an orientation rather than an interview. However, maybe this would work in her favor. Maybe this was just a formality, and she and the other girl were already in? Grace tried her best to sound confident as she introduced herself as a freshman and stated truthfully that she had only heard about the club through talk on campus, leaving out the bit that talk on campus really meant she had simply overheard rumors from the other students' conversations. After introductions were finished, Rosemary and Devon sat, Devon pulling out 2 papers from a folder on the coffee table in front of them that Grace thought looked like their applications. Rosemary took one of the papers and placed it in front of her. Folding her hands in her lap, she smiled brightly and spoke again. "I'm obligated to mention that there won't be any special treatment, biases, or extra privileges granted regarding Miss Willow Foss's familial relationship to an already existing member of Filii Noctis. She looked up at Willow. "Do you recognize this and agree?" "Yes, ma'am," Willow nodded, grinning wide. Let it also be known that while this is Grace's first interview, this is Willow's second interview at Filii Noctis. And while these interviews will be conducted together, they will be treated as separate matters. She looked up at the young women. "Do you understand and agree?" Grace and Willow both responded with the affirmative, but Grace now had even more questions. Was she going to need to go through multiple interviews like this? Why couldn't they conduct the interviews separately? Why was there no mention of multiple interviews in the email? This was just a club, and there didn't seem to be hordes of applicants, so why was there a need for multiple interviews anyway? Grace kept these questions to herself as Rosemary began to speak again. "Let us begin. Will Miss Willow Faust please step forward?" Willow left Grace's side and stepped into the circle quietly. "Your last interview, you received the first act of initiation, and therefore you will be required to carry out the second act tonight. Do you recognize this and agree?" "Yes, ma'am," Willow replied, only this time she seemed less giddy than before. Grace couldn't see her face, but from the sound of Willow's voice, it implied her previous grin had fallen. Regardless, Grace was becoming ever more confused. Acts of initiation? Wasn't this meant to be an interview? If they were indeed expected to go through multiple rounds of these so-called interviews, why would they already be initiating Willow into the club? Isn't that sort of thing usually done only after one has been accepted? Were these interviews really a series of tests? Furthermore, what act was Willow meant to carry out? Grace thought she could now see why this club had the reputation it did. It was definitely proving very strange, and she wasn't even 10 minutes into the interview yet. Grace's thoughts were interrupted by Rosemary saying her name and beckoning her to step forward with Willow. It wasn't until she felt a change in texture under her feet that she looked down and noticed that a clear film covered the floor inside the circle. That's really strange, Grace thought, but she didn't have time to dwell on it as Rosemary was already speaking again. The first part of your interview will involve Willow's second act of initiation, which, upon completion, will determine how we proceed with your interview. Do you understand this and accept? Grace nodded and responded with a yes, but inside her brain was spinning. Firstly, what did she mean the first part of her interview would be dependent on whether act Willow was meant to carry out? Hadn't she just said their interviews would be treated as separate matters? This didn't feel like separate matters. More importantly, would Willow be doing something to her? Grace considered backing out, considered saying, "To hell with this," and running back to her dorm, back to the comfort of her books. Was her mother's threat really worth whatever this was? Maybe she could call her mother and make a plea, tell her that she would definitely pledge to join one of the sororities next fall, no questions asked. However, Grace knew her mother and knew she wouldn't negotiate. It was either go along with this, or she would need to forget about re-enrolling for the spring semester. Maybe she was just overreacting, letting her anxieties of something new get the better of her. Grace took a deep breath and decided to stick it out. Whatever it was couldn't be that bad, right? Rosemary addressed Willow again. She smiled and said in a calm voice, "Miss Faust, you may begin your second act of initiation now." Willow was on Grace before she really had a chance to realize what had happened. The next thing Grace knew was that Willow had her by her shoulders and was attempting to pull her closer. Grace shrieked in surprise when she saw Willow open her mouth, watching as two long, sharp fangs protracted from her upper gums like the retractable claws of a cat, or perhaps that more likened to that of a spider. No, not a spider. A vampire. Grace's eyes widened. She was going to die. She was going to die, being sucked dry by a freaking vampire, all because she was trying to join some dumb club she didn't even want to be a part of in the first place. She couldn't even scream. She just looked up at the face of her attacker with a quiet horror as her breath caught in her chest. She closed her eyes, resigning herself to her fate. But nothing happened. Grace slowly regained her ability to breathe and braced herself, knowing her end would surely come soon. Still, nothing happened. Grace opened her eyes. Willow was staring back at her, her fangs retracting and her mouth trembling when she closed it. She released Grace and stepped back. Rosemary cleared her throat. Miss Faust? Is there a problem? I can't, Willow said, her voice wavering. She glanced to a member in one of the seats next to the couch, and Grace followed her gaze. A young man with dark hair and a striking resemblance to Willow looked clearly distraught, but he remained silent. Grace assumed this must be Willow's sibling. Shall it go on the record that you forfeit, Miss Faust? Asked Rosemary. Willow began to shake. Her eyes darted between the club president, her brother, and Grace. She stuttered, I can't. She looked again to her brother and her voice cracked. I'm so sorry. I can't. Tears started to fall down the young man's face as his expression became a mixture of frustration, anger, and sadness. But still he remained silent, as he too shook. Though grateful she wasn't dead, Grace quickly got the impression that Willow had just done something terribly wrong. Let it go on the record that Miss Willow Faust has forfeited, Rosemary said, without an ounce of emotion. She said more, but Grace couldn't hear over Willow's desperate wails as Mr. Grayson and another man stood and began to approach Willow with no more emotion than Rosemary had spared. The men grabbed Willow as she wailed for mercy, crying out something about another chance and how she wouldn't tell a soul. Grace looked towards Willow's brother again. He made no move to help his sister, just sat motionless as tears ran down his face. It was as if he knew exactly the price of his sister's forfeiture, and knew he was powerless to stop it. Grace turned back to Willow just in time to see Mr. Grayson rip her head clean off her shoulders, immediately silencing her wails as he threw it into the fireplace. With the other man, they made quick work of her body, tearing it limb from limb and throwing everything into the fireplace to join her head. They finished in mere moments, and just as quickly and as calmly as they had risen, they retook their seats as if nothing had happened. Grace stared shakily at the bloody smear that was once Willow, before the sound of a click in the dead silence caught her attention, and she turned her gaze back towards the club chapter leaders. The vice president had opened a wooden box containing 2 large stamps and a pad of red ink. Grace watched as he pressed one of the stamps into the ink pad, and with a sigh, stamped the words "Admission Denied" on Willow's application. He placed the stamped paper back into the folder and handed the other paper, Grace's application, to Rosemary. Rosemary took the application and placed it in front of her. Folding her hands in her lap, she looked up and smiled brightly at Grace. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed that story, and my art for the first day of Drawlloween. Before I let you go, I'd like to feature some art. Check out this piece from artist Gladrill Ream on DeviantArt. If you'd like to see more of her work, then check out the links in the description. Also, if you want a chance for your art to be featured in a future video, I am currently accepting submissions over on DeviantArt. All my links are down below. Thank you again for watching. I just want to take a moment to say I'll be posting each day of October for Drawlloween. So if you haven't already, and you'd like to be, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss out on any other creepy videos. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.